Okay, so welcome everyone to the second episode of the Silk Roads and Monsoon Winds podcast, a podcast in everything modern Asia. I'm your host Imran. You can find me on Twitter at MalayBoy97. Joining me today is Mr. Manimugdha Sharma. He's the current news editor for the Times of India, military history enthusiast, and aficionado of quizzing. You can find his Times of India pieces on his blog, Passing Shot. And as you told me yesterday, you are currently writing a book on Akbar the Great. Am I mistaken?
No, that is true. And hello, everyone. This is Manimugdha Sharma, and thank you very much, Imran, for having me on your show.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for joining me. That's very kind. When exactly do you plan to release this book, and what can readers expect from it?
That really depends on my publisher, but we are looking at sometime in the middle of this year.
Okay.
It has been announced already that it's coming out sometime in the middle of this year. And I'm really hoping that it would be accepted and by the readers and hopefully by people like you and your audience, because I haven't really written it only for Indians. I believe something like that should really have a global reach.
Yes.
So
yes.
I try to connect as many global trends as possible in that. Now, I'll not reveal too much about the book because that would really kill the surprise.
No spoilers yet. Just,
absolutely.
Keep us in suspense. Yeah.
But yes, it's on the Mughals, the Mughal Empire.
Specifically Akbar or just the Mughals in general?
No, specifically Akbar, but right. I'm also tracing the general history of the Mughal Empire and that.
Okay.
Of course, not going into specifics, but it's essentially a character sketch, a profile sketch of Emperor Akbar and the times that he lived in, and how do we look at him from a 21st century perspective.
Okay.
I mean, that is really something which historians generally tend to avoid. When you're writing about any early modern ruler, you tend to argue that we need to see them in their own context. Of course, that's what I'm doing as well. But at the same time, I'm trying to look at him from the modern perspective because that's where all the politics lies of our times.
Yes, of course.
And in my country, that has been the focal point of debate ever since a new government came to power in 2014, and suddenly all the Muslim rulers of India of the past, they suddenly became topics of discussion, and not just topics of discussion, by the way. They even became electoral issues. Okay, and in fact, elections have been fought in the name of Akbar and Aurangzeb and Alauddin Khilji and Tipu Sultan. These are all, kings of our past. And of course, the names have been used as sticks to beat the Muslims with. So that's why I thought I would write a book on that.
Well, I think we'll all be excited to read it.
Thank you very much. I'm pretty counting on that.
So, as for those of you who listened to the first podcast, we were discussing the first podcast was my one of my passions, which is politics. Today, we're going to discuss another passion of mine, which is history. In this case, specifically military history, and more specifically, Indian military history. So, I'm just curious to know, how did you become passionate about military history? What was the impetus to kind of delve into this?
Okay, I think that's a good question. This is not something I've really nobody has asked me that, and I haven't really asked myself that question as well. So I think I remember distinctly that my interest in military history, and in fact in history as well as in military history, arose when in the late 1980s, there was a TV show, called The Sword of Tipu Sultan. And it was a biopic on him, and of course a very positive portrayal of Tipu Sultan.
Yes.
But it was made like a film. And in the 1980s, when television technology was not so advanced, when we saw footage like that, and it was made with film cameras. Okay, so it was made like a movie,
Yes.
and it had a very grand cast. The most popular actors, film actors, as well as television actors, theater actors of the time, very good actors, all of them, of course.
Mm.
So they were playing different roles in that serial. And what really attracted me was the battle scenes. Okay.
Yes.
And I think, and when I look back at it today, I think that the battle scenes were even more grand
Mm.
than they were in reality in Tipu Sultan's own times. Okay, and the depictions were perhaps a little more Mughal than
Mm.
Tipu, but of course, to my mind at that time, and I was just not even 10 years old. So at that time, those gripping scenes, the battle
Yes.
scenes with cannon bursts and cavalry charges, all of that happening in different episodes, and these used to happen more frequently. Okay, and so that really attracted me. So I would always look forward to other television programs where you could hear or see those cannon bursts and cavalry charges.
Mm.
So and I think that really cast an impression in my mind that okay, this is something that I really like. So when you like something when so early on, you tend to when you grow up, then you tend to that liking stays with you. It only becomes more strong.
Mm.
So and of course, every boy of my age when I was growing up in school used to be a fan of the Indian military. Okay,
Yes.
so and we used to hear things like, and of course, insurgency in Kashmir had started, and so the glory and the sacrifice of the Indian troops used to be broadcast by television, or the state broadcaster, as well as the newspapers
Mm.
and magazines. And then there were movies in the 90s. There was a movie called Border, which talked about the India-Pakistan War of 1971.
Mm.
And so that really inspired a lot of us. So I was in school, and you saw all those, very patriotic scenes until on the silver screen, and so automatically you had a feeling within you that
Mm.
you wanted to be a soldier when you grow up. And then when I was again in school, we had the Kargil War. So that was, I think, a an event that really triggered my interest specifically in military.
Mm.
Um, because that was when I was growing up and I was sufficiently big enough to understand what was happening. And the stories of sacrifice and the images, and we had satellite news channels reporting from the battlefront at that time. So all that daily footage used to come in, and the commentaries and all that. So I really wanted to be a soldier at that time.
Yeah.
Every young boy of my age wanted to just pick up a gun and go to the front. Of course, that did not happen, and I did not eventually join the military.
Mm.
But the interest stayed on pretty much. And then when I was in college and I passed out of the university, I realized that this is one aspect of history that I really want to work on further.
Yes.
And thankfully, when I joined this profession, and specifically the Times of India, where I am currently working, they really encouraged my passion. So I eventually became a writer of military history or commentator on military history. So that's to give you the journey in short.
Yeah, I think I am very excited for this conversation because as someone who's very much into reading military history like you, something I've always noticed is that there's huge libraries of military history on, say, like British military history or American
Right.
military history or World War One or World War Two. But I've
Right.
noticed that India seems to be largely ignored until maybe quite recently. Um,
Right.
I mean, why do you think that is? Do you think it's because part of me sometimes feels that maybe it's based on this stereotype of the Gandhian legacy of nonviolence and Indians as this very maybe inherently peaceful people. Do you think that's kind of affected the
Well,
yeah
that probably influenced our understanding of conflicts in a
mm,
way, but I don't think that is true in its entirety.
Yes.
Um, I think what has happened is there is actually no clear memory of any war in India. Okay, the last real conflict that ever happened in the Indian subcontinent was the revolt of 1857.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
and that's pretty far removed in time for anyone to have any living memory
Mm.
of the conflict. What really survived were those tales, the bardic tales, and the wandering minstrels. They used to
Mm.
relate these tales of depredations carried out by the British and the atrocities on the people and the glorious fight of the people.
Mm.
The tales of pain and suffering was what really inspired these stories, you know. So, but then there was absolutely no physical memory of it. Okay,
Mm.
so when you have the First World War, you have the Second World War happen. These are not really touching Indian shores, right?
Mm.
So you have Indians going out to different parts of the globe to fight those wars, but then at home there was not much happening. Of course, there was panic. There was in the First World War, you had a German ship bomb the southern coast,
Mm.
and suddenly in that part of the country there was some panic uh, uh, and some consciousness perhaps that okay, there's a global
Yes.
conflict which is happening. But in the rest of the country, and especially let's say Punjab, where you had the maximum recruitment taking place for the Indian army, so there was consciousness that okay, our men are going out to fight. But then that feeling that when you have a real war happening right at your doorstep, you tend to get a different feeling from
Mm.
that than a secondhand experience where somebody you have in your family who goes out to a foreign field, fights a war, and comes back and tells you tales of what he saw. So the two experiences are very different,
Yes.
right? So that memory of a real war was never there. So even in independent India, we have fought three wars, full scale wars, in 48 and 65, in 71, and limited intensity conflict in 99 and again in 1962 with the Chinese.
Mm.
But all these conflicts have been confined to the borders of the country,
Yes.
right? Where only the locals, say Kashmiris, have experienced some tension, and maybe the frontier areas of Punjab in 65,
Mm.
they experienced that. But otherwise, the vast majority of the country had absolutely no experience, no sense of the war. So when you don't experience something like that, you don't really develop a culture where war memory is honored and remembered and shared.
So maybe let's talk about warfare in India in the pre-colonial period.
Right,
You mentioned you were writing a book on Akbar the Great, and I think that's a great place to start in the sense of looking at the Mughal dynasties.
right,
So, as most people know, India was under the rule of a single Muslim family for about 200 years. I say about effective rule for about 200 years, uh,
right.
from about the 16th to the 18th century. Um, how exactly were the Mughals able to conquer most of the subcontinent? What was the character of warfare in the subcontinent during this period, and how were the Mughals able to um, uh, militarily defeat all your enemies? I guess.
Hmm. Oh, that's a good question. Well, see, the Mughals, and if we talk about them, then we also actually need to go a little further back in time,
Mm.
because the Mughals are not operating in isolation. And
Yes.
that was a period when you have several Turkoman, Turkic dynasties come up in Central Asia. It's really the post-Mongol period
Mm.
where you have these different sultanates and in different parts of the world, in Central Asia, and then going as far as West Asia and also to the gates of Europe. You see the Osman dynasty or the Ottoman Empire, which comes up.
Mm.
These are Turkic people again. And you see the Safavids have their own empire in Persia. And you have the Mughals here. And their warfare was, there was no uniform way of defining a Mughal way of war.
Mm.
I don't think there's any way of war, not even that Western way of war, which they often talk about,
Yes.
because everyone had their own styles and there's no one uniform Western way of fighting and one uniform Eastern way of fighting. The Mughals really fought like how other Central Asians used to fight. And if you would see that Babur, when he comes to India, he brings with him a small army, a relatively small army of just about 11,000. And I think that even the fighting component was even smaller than that.
Yes.
Because Babur, in his own memoirs, he talks about at one instance when he's crossing the Indus and he doesn't really know how many people he has. And he says that probably he was advised that just about 6,000 odd people are there with him who can actually bear arms. So, but then let's just go with the conventional estimate that he had about 11,000 troops with him when he challenged the Lodhis, who were the ruling dynasty in India, in North India at least, at that time. And he brings his artillery, which he gets from the Turks, and he challenges the Lodhis, and he wins the day at Panipat in 1526. Now, of course, a lot of emphasis has been laid on the use of gunpowder weapons.
Yes, I was going to add that, yeah, as you said, the Mughal Empire has been referred to as the gunpowder empire. And
right.
There's this notion that guns and firearms were some kind of revolutionary introduction into the subcontinent that allowed them to win.
Right. But that is not so, really. But if you would, I think that used to be the traditional view. And Hodgson and his partner, when they gave the theory that these were essentially the gunpowder empires, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals of India. But that is a very doubtful claim to make, because gunpowder was not really essential for their rise. You'll see the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid empires are already empires before they take up gunpowder weapons. The Mughals come, they learn from what the Persians experienced at Chaldoran in 1514. The Chaldoran is that very it's an epic battle that happened between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire. So it was essentially an old way of fighting, which was represented by the Persians, who had placed maximum reliance on their cavalry, the Qizilbash. Okay, and on the other hand, you had a very modern army by the standards of the time, because the Ottoman army was the first to have firearms and, in fact, organized infantry corps equipped with firearms, the Janissaries, and field artillery formations. So they had really learned how to, use field artillery, and using wagon lagers, which they saw in Bulgaria. Okay, the Hungarians were the first to use it, and that technology, and they were very quick to adopt. And at Chaldoran, they do that completely, and they completely smash the Ottoman, the Safavid armies. Now Babur is watching it. Okay, so he's a very good student of military. He was a very good student of military history. So he was taking lessons from that, and he saw that the Turks have a weapon which is unbeatable, and so he takes that. He gets Ottoman officers, and he gets them to train his army to use weapons. But then his troops are not very keen, and in fact his generals, the Mirzas and others, who are either of his family or they're of his clan, they are the most reluctant to use firearms because they are cavalrymen, and cavalrymen pride themselves as being the best soldiers, and the moment they saw that there's a weapon that can take them down at a great distance, they disliked it. They thought that this is very unsoldier-like, very unmanly way of fighting. But then Babur, being a great commander, he actually he makes his troops, his generals, agree to his point that, okay, this is a new way of warfare, and probably it's good, because Babur at that time was a nomad. He had lost Samarkand. He was gaining his foothold in Kabul. He really didn't have a homeland that time, and he was looking to expand eastwards. So these guns come, and he brings his artillery all the way to India. But then his artillery achieves very limited success. I mean, that's really what, when I was going through the accounts myself, and I realized that, okay, probably there's far too much reliance which has been placed by historians on Babur's artillery. Because artillery, his guns were firing one shot every quarter of an hour. And in a battle where you have cavalry armies charging at you, if your guns are firing just one shot every quarter of an hour, then that's not a way to go about. That's not a winning weapon at all.
Mm.
Because the Mughals did not know how to cool their guns. Okay, so the guns would explode.
Mm.
So that's not something that they really enjoyed doing. But they had their mounted archers, and that's what was the battle-winning arm for the Mughals. Mounted archers, the light cavalry, and they practiced this tactic called tolkama, which is essentially a Central Asian tactic where you have these wings which converge, they overlap, they try to surround you, and they just pepper you down with arrows.
Mm.
And then the enemy is reduced to a confused mass, okay? And then you have the heavy cavalry that goes out and delivers the knockout blow. So that's what had happened at Panipat as well in 1526. So his cannons did fire, but then those shots actually scared away Ibrahim Lodi's elephants.
Mm.
Then they killed enemy soldiers. But his musketeers, of course, played a big role, and his archers. So this was something very new in the Indian subcontinent, even though gunpowder weapons had been used earlier in India. In fact, you have gunpowder weapons. We see evidence of that, the use of gunpowder weapons in India from the 15th century onwards.
Mm.
But Babur is really the first who brings field artillery into the game. But you see that within 20 years of Babur's coming, you have different Indian armies and Indian princes and principalities. They also have their own cannons and field artilleries in place.
Mm.
Because when Babur's son Humayun fights Sher Shah Suri, the Suri also comes with his own pack of artillery. And different Indian princes, of course, they also have their own artillery. So that knowledge really spreads with the coming of the Mughals. When Akbar comes, by that time you have the Afghans who are powerful, you have the Rajputs who are powerful. They all have gunpowder weapons now.
Mm.
In the early 16th century, the mid 16th century. So that original advantage that say Babur had was no longer available to the Mughals. So they introduced their Central Asian way of warfare, using light cavalry, mounted archers, and Mughal mounted archers were actually their trump card. So even in losing battles, we see that the moment they let loose their mounted archers, and then all hell breaks loose in the enemy ranks. So that's how Akbar starts building his empire. Although Akbar is also learning newer ways of fighting technologies, and he improves his gunpowder weapons. So you see at Chittor and at Ranthambore, and these are the places which are considered to be battles which were really difficult, and these were considered to be impregnable fortresses. And Akbar conquers them by using gunpowder weapons this time. His artillery is powerful. He uses sappers and miners. He uses mines to blow up fort walls. These are, and then he uses covered trenches called sabats. So this is something we see during Akbar's time, and which are being used elsewhere in the conflict in the country as well. So he lays siege to the fort of Surat, where there's a Portuguese fleet which is coming to the assistance of the garrison, and then he sees that the Portuguese realize that, okay, this is not any other Indian army. This army is equipped with a very heavy artillery. So the Portuguese instead decide to offer parley, and then they try to become an ally of the Mughals. So that really changes. So for the first time, you have an Indian power which is coming into the scene and which can actually dominate the battlefield. So that advantage the Mughals enjoy till the early 18th century.
I think it's interesting how you talked about how the Mughals kind of assimilated into the kind of the local context, because and I think you've alluded to this initially. You were saying how there's been quite a lot of politicization of Mughal history, and
right.
I always felt that conflict during this period has always been kind of portrayed as Hindus versus Muslims, and
Right.
I think certainly kind of the rise of modern Hindu nationalism has kind of certainly influenced that kind of thinking.
Right.
Do you think that's necessarily a fair portrayal of what was happening, or do you think
No,
that?
that's a very unfair portrayal, of course,
Mm,
because there was absolutely no Hindu-Muslim angle. Of course, religion was always a friction point. We
yes.
have to agree. Even though there was much peace and amity between Hindus and Muslims in the Indian subcontinent, but there were occasional fissures as well, and
Mm,
and if it was one kingdom versus another, then often you would find very religious rhetoric being mouthed by the rulers. Okay. Even when Akbar wins at Chittor,
mm,
that's essentially um, a Hindu Rajput kingdom. Uh, so he issues a proclamation, a victory proclamation, which is, to a modern reader, it would appear um, very obscene, because the
mm,
kind of language that has been used is actually you don't tend to associate that with Akbar, because the kind of image that he has otherwise as being
yes.
a very tolerant and egalitarian sort of a person. Um, so if you read that victory proclamation, then it gives you a very different idea. But then we have to understand that these these were templated documents, which had very minimum circulation.
Mm,
These were circulated among the nobility, and it was occasionally used to inspire the troops. Because then you see that the religion in this case has been used as a morale booster. But we
yes.
know that religion did not play much of a role when it came to governance, when it came to assimilation and all that. Because the polity, the Mughal and Akbar is in fact the first ruler who separates religion from the state.
Move on to the British Raj and warfare under the Raj.
Hmm.
So, following the Mughals, as you obviously know, the British established control of India, first under the
Right.
Honorable British East India Company, and later under the Queen Victoria and the British Crown. Um, Now, initially, uh, going back a bit, you were skeptical of this notion of the quote unquote Western versus Eastern way of war,
That is true.
which is interesting because certainly I think in a lot of military history today there seems to be this kind of great enthusiasm for looking at the cultural elements of warfare and military history.
Right.
Um, a good example would be the late Sir John Keegan, who made a point about how Western warfare is about. He talks about how it's about an emphasis on infantry,
Right.
uh, frontal attacks, always going in for the attack, and drill and discipline, as you mentioned.
Right.
And he compares that to the Eastern way of war, which he says is about evasion, delay, and kind of indirect warfare. When you look at the performance of the East India Company, the British, sorry, the East India Company Army in India, do you
Hmm.
think that's a fair assessment to make? Do you think that's what allowed the the company to defeat all of its enemies?
Yeah, I think it's far more complicated than that. As I said, you can never really have very simplistic explanations for events of history,
Hmm.
because you see that there's a whole lot of factors come into play. Now, Western way of war, as you say, is essentially that theory that says that, and they give the example of the Greek hoplite, the Greek
Yes.
soldier who is, that exemplar of all infantry soldiers, that he goes for the kill, and all their wars are very decisive wars.
Hmm.
Okay. And then of course the other agreement comes into play, that okay, the eastern way of war is different because you have very vast armies, disorganized armies, and they evade conflict, they evade battle. It's always asymmetric warfare that they try to bring to the table.
Yes.
That is not true, because you have had several decisive conflicts even in the East. Okay. And if you just see the conduct of the East India Company in its initial days, what really happens? You have the War of Austrian Succession,
Hmm.
in the War of Austrian Succession in 1740-48. That's the period which happens in Europe. That comes to India as well. where the French and the British are fighting on Indian soil. Okay, and the French land an army in Madras. Madras is really where the East India Company is based, and that's their stronghold. And the French company, it lands troops in Madras, and that's a huge army, going by that period's numbers. And the English fort is guarded by a smaller, much smaller force, and they have about 200 guns
Hmm.
and just about 100 people to service those guns. And the British, they surrender.
Hmm.
They surrender the fort, the city. And it's only when after that the treaty happens in the 1748, then they decide that, okay, we are going to give back, we're going to return the possessions, and the French return Madras. Well, what had really happens in between is when the British surrender the fort in 1746 and the French take over, then the British have their local allies. You see, the East India Company as well as the French East India Company, they are all having their own Indian allies. Okay, they are all trying to interfere in Indian affairs by that time.
Yes.
So the British have their ally in the Nawab of Arcot. Now, Arcot was an original Mughal Suba or a province.
Hmm.
Okay, in the south they had several. They divided the empire into different districts, so states or subas. So Bengal was a huge suba. You had Gujarat as a huge suba. So in the south you had Arcot and Sira. These were huge Mughal provinces. So the Nawab of Arcot was really a Mughal viceroy, but he was functioning as an independent ruler, and he was doing striking his own treaties with different powers. So he had his treaty, a friendship treaty with the British. So when the British lose Madras, they ask the Nawab of Arcot to come to their help.
Hmm.
So the Nawab of Arcot sends a huge army of about 10,000, primarily a cavalry army, to recover or recapture the fort of Madras, the say Fort St. George. Now, uh, to face them, the French send another army, which has about 700 Indians and 300 French or Europeans. Okay,
Hmm.
so just about 1,000 odd people. And this army, the Indians, are trained by the French, and they fight the British, or let's say the Nawab of Arcot's forces. And because it's a drilled infantry, they go for the volley fire and the bayonet charge. The Mughal army flees.
Hmm.
Okay, so you have an English ally which has fled the battlefield. But the British see that, and they realize that, okay, then it's possible to raise an army of Indians, equip them with European arms, train them in a European fashion, and you will have a soldier who is as good as a European soldier, if not better.
And these are the famous sepoys, right?
These are the famous sepoys. So it's really the French who teach or show the way to the British
Hmm.
to raise Indian armies. So the English, being fast learners, they raise their own Indian armies, and then you have what we over a certain period of time you have a pretty invincible army,
Hmm.
um, which is regularly paid, which is a very big factor for guaranteeing loyalty.
Hmm.
Because we see in India what used to happen earlier. You have forts, whenever you are laying siege to a fort, you would often find the garrison has not been paid for months.
Hmm.
So you could really bargain with them, and you could tell them that, okay, we're going to pay you your dues. You just hand over the fort to us.
Hmm.
And since nobody wants to be in conflict permanently, so they agree and they hand over the fort. So this is something that the British find very strange in India, because their understanding of war is very different. But in India, they see that, okay, they are not really willing to fight. if
Yeah.
you if you pay your troops regularly, they will never desert you.
Hmm.
But if you don't, and then you think about holding a territory with troops that have not been paid for months, then of course that's inviting trouble. Any Indian ruler would pay them and you will lose your possessions. That actually happens with the British, and the British do the same to Indians. So they buy out garrisons and they conquer territories just like that without even having to fire a shot. That happens.
So it's I guess it's a way of them kind of assimilating into
Yes.
Indian way of I guess.
So it's not that the British ever had it easy in India. It's just that they had one thing going for them, and that was all their commercial possessions. Their homeland was elsewhere. So all their trade was international. And all their trade was the trade centers or the power centers were located in places where you had the sea or the ocean routes. So being land forces, and since barring the Marathas and the Siddhis who were Mughal allies, you really did not have an Indian power. And even Tipu Sultan tried to have a fleet, but then he was not very successful with that. So barring the Marathas, who had some success having a navy, and the Siddhis, who were Mughal allies, you did not have any Indian power that also had a powerful navy. So without a powerful navy, you could not have challenged British trade. If you're not challenging British trade, or if you're not harming their commercial interests, you are not really causing them much harm overall. You cannot defeat them because they have these infinite reserves of cash that they can get.
So the British could essentially dominate the kind of local military economy, I guess. Yes.
Right. And they dominated the military economy because they had the money. The Indian powers, their resources were limited. The British could afford to pay their troops in cash. Okay. And they offered regular and decent employment. Because the moment you see East India Company's armies come up and the local Indian powers realize that, okay, now the British have these drilled infantry and these armies are loyal to the British because they are paying them regularly. So the Indian powers also try to pay their troops regularly. Mysore tries to do it. The Marathas try it with some success. They were not very successful with that. Only the Scindia and the Holkar, they were the two Maratha Sardars or princes, the commanders rather, who had some success by raising European-style divisions and paying them regularly. The Sikhs try to do that by paying them regularly. So, you see, they are learning from the British, and they're trying to play the English in their own game. But because they don't have infinite resources, I mean, if you are not ruling over the entire country, your resources are limited. So look at Mysore, look at Marathas, look at everyone else, the Sikhs. Their territories are limited, so their resources are also limited. You cannot go on fighting the East India Company and its armies forever. Right, because the English are going to have their armies coming from elsewhere. They have other allies over there. And they have the money. The money routes are still pretty much intact for the British. So how are you going to challenge them? So there was literally no way unless you had a powerful navy yourself. So, yes, so the Indians, like I said, because of this reason, they find it very difficult to beat the British. But otherwise, in many engagements that we see, they actually had the advantage of the British because they learned the British way of war or the European way of war. And Mysore was particularly very successful because Mysore never really abandoned its own way of war, the cavalry-dominated way of fighting. Mysorean light cavalry caused a lot of trouble for the British. So that's why you would find the British describe the Mysore cavalry in terrible terms. They would call it the swarm of locusts. Okay, because that's how the cavalry was. They would harass, they would completely destroy their supply chains, attack their bag and baggage. They really had developed this way of fighting where you have the cavalry working in tandem with the infantry and the artillery. Because Mysorean infantry was also very good. Mysorean artillery has been written about in glowing terms by foreign observers of the time, because their artillery used to be very accurate. And that was also true about the Sikh artillery, because you see the Anglo-Sikh wars, what are the British talking about? They are terrified by the fact that the Sikh gunners who are essentially all Muslims, by the way, majority Muslims. The Sikh gunners were Muslims.
Hmm.
And these gunners are firing accurately on English positions. So they are taking out gun crews completely, and they're raining hell and fire on the British, and they're terrified by that. So, and then that's why they developed a great deal of respect for the Sikhs because of their artillery. It was so accurate and very powerful. And you also see that to a certain extent with the Marathas later, especially the Scindia's artillery. It was very powerful. And the British really suffer because when Lord Lake fights his campaign in North in 1802, that's during the Second Anglo-Maratha War, as well as Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington,
Hmm.
they all encounter very accurate fire by the Maratha gunners.
Yeah, I think if I recall, was it Asai? The artillery was the barrage was so strong that Wellington
Yes,
decided just to charge the Maratha line. There was no way they could
right.
just
Right.
stand
And the
there.
Maratha gunners, by the way, when they were charged at by the cavalry, the British cavalry, they feigned death.
Hmm.
So when the cavalry went forward, they again rose up, turned their guns, and started fighting at the cavalry
Hmm.
from behind.
Hmm.
But eventually, of course, due to several factors, there was no proper Maratha commander who was present in that battle. It was again, I think, a Dutchman who was leading the Maratha armies, and many of the Maratha allies, for instance, the Gaikwar, the Bhosle,
Hmm.
he did not participate, and so did another Maratha ally, Begum Samru.
Hmm.
She withdrew with her army and her park of artillery. So the Scindia was left to fight all by himself. So that was one of the reasons. And you did not have a commander, and you did not have a system. And another reason why the British were so successful was because they had their officer corps. The British officer corps was actually its trump card. In India, the Indian sepoys, they really treated the British with a lot of respect
Hmm.
because they saw that the commanders are straight ahead of them. They are fighting with them, and they're also falling in battle. So someone who fights like that and who leads from the front always makes for a great commander. So his soldiers will always follow him, and if he's also dying in battle. So we see this in in the British-led Indian Army,
Hmm.
right down to the very end of the Raj. So there's a lot of respect, and you immediately command loyalty. So it's not just money. Of course, regular play is very important, but it's also this that you develop a philosophy where your soldier respects you because you command their respect, because you're leading from the front. You're also dying in battle with them.
And
So no
I
one can
think
just.
also the way the British organized the military was that even if many of the officers died,
Yes, yes.
it
There's
didn't
always
mean the
somebody
army
else.
didn't collapse. There was still
Right.
someone to take over that.
Absolutely, and that was not so with the case of the Indian armies,
Hmm.
in armies of the Indian princes. So, if one Sardar, if the king or the prince died, the army would completely melt away. So that prince getting killed was a disastrous event in a battle in India.
Hmm.
But the same was not so for an English or a European-led army because you would always have that command structure. So if a general is killed, then you have a lieutenant general who is coming in. Then you have a major general who is coming in, and then there's always the chain of command which is there. So you have these battalion officers who are leading their units, their companies and sections, and so at every level the command structure was pretty much well defined.
Hmm.
So these were uh, effective fighting units as a result. The same was not true about the Indian army. So you have the prince dying, and the army completely melts away. And then the British officer was actually a trump card, and I have always said this. I've even written about it. I think it has not been sufficiently focused upon because uh, you always tend to, when you're writing a history, especially if it's a popular author of military history. I'm not talking about an academic author. If it's a popular author of military history, he also tends to bring his own fascination for guns
Hmm.
into the picture. So
Gun,
you,
It's the
is a
it's the less sexy part of military history, I guess.
absolutely, absolutely. And
Oh,
anyone, you see any military enthusiast today, they would be very thorough with their guns,
mm,
knowledge of the guns. They can, tell you that, okay, this gun is of that make and made in that particular year. What kind of an impact the gun brings to the table is actually a different argument
yeah,
altogether. So yeah, so that's why I think a lot of emphasis has been laid on the British having better guns, and I have heard very respected authors make that argument as well. That okay, the British won because they had better guns. Actually not, because the British also had the whole command structure in place. They had everything going for them, a huge economy. They controlled the military economies. They got the best recruits, and uh, they had their own war doctrines. And
because certainly I think you can't talk about um, British military power in India without remembering that a lot of these soldiers were actually native Indian soldiers.
absolutely,
So let's
absolutely.
talk about maybe the sepoys and what exactly motivates them to join the East India Company army. And also, maybe let's also delve into the idea of the martial race theory, because I think that very much influenced how the sepoys were selected and all. Like, how exactly did the British come to this conclusion that certain groups were quote unquote more martial than others?
That martial races theory is completely bunkum,
Mm.
and I think every historian, military historian worth his salt, has actually poo-pooed it completely,
Yeah. Mm.
and rightly, because we see that if you look at the entire history of the East India Company's military in India, then you would see that till 1857, their Bengal army,
Mm.
which was primarily a North India based infantry, and even though the name Bengal was used, there was actually no Bengali in that, or very few Bengalis. I'm not sure how many, but the fighting men actually came from what is today UP and Bihar, and these were at least in the infantry. They came from the upper castes:
Mm.
Brahmins, Bhumihars, Rajputs, Thakurs. These are the castes that dominated the East India Company's infantry, and these were the same soldiers from coming from these regions, which were later uh, labeled as non-martial. So they were not recruited much into the Indian army.
Mm.
But till 1857, the Bengal army was the biggest army of the East India Company, and it was really the Bengal army that actually defeats the Sikhs, defeats the Gurkhas in Nepal, and the Bengal army is sent overseas as well,
Mm.
fight in Burma and elsewhere. So the same sepoys who give a very good account of themselves in battle in different theaters of the war are declared non-martial after 1857. Now it's very remarkable that it is the Bengal army, the same sepoys from UP and Bihar, who defeat the Sikhs during the two Anglo-Sikh wars, and the Sikhs are then, of course, recruited into the East India Company's army,
Mm.
both as regulars and irregulars, and more as irregulars during the revolt of 1857. The armies were very diverse, and in 1857 they realized when the Bengal army mutinies completely. So of the 74 native infantry regiments in 1857, and that's about 139 or 140,000 people,
Mm.
soldiers bearing arms. You have only about 12 regiments that make it to the army list of 1859.
Mm.
So of 74, only 12 remain in the list. Everyone else mutinies. And immediately the British think that, okay, these are not people we want to have in our armies again. Of course, the recruitment does not stop completely. You still have upper castes being recruited. They even raised a regiment of Brahmins called the Brahmans during the
Mm.
First World War, which fought in the First World War. But by and large, they realized that okay, the Sikhs, the Pathans, the Punjabi Muslims are, and the Gurkhas after the Anglo Gurkha wars, they started recruiting the Gurkhas into their army as well. So they are all Bengal Native Infantry. And after 1857, they raise a new Bengal army where you have more Gurkhas, you have more Sikhs, and Punjabi Muslims and Pathans. So the nature of the Bengal army changes, the composition changes. And after the Second Afghan War, they come up with this, they theorize this into the martial races, that only some races in India are martial or more martial than the rest. And so accordingly, the nature of the Indian army changes. But then you have the Bombay army, which also has Sikhs in its ranks by now. You see the Madras army, where after the Second Afghan War, they are not pretty much in favor of having more Madrasis in their army. And the army is also again amalgamated. So you have by 1893, the Lord Kitchener's reforms come in, and then you combine all the provincial armies and the presidential armies, and then you have one Indian army. So now recruitment is again very skewed in favor of the North Indians. So these the Sikhs, Pathans, and Punjabi Muslims.
Does that legacy still continue with the modern Indian military? Do certain
Oh,
groups
it does.
still dominate? Okay, I
It
see.
does. It does. It does pretty much. And you see, it's a very controversial, but the Indian National Congress during the freedom movement, one of the things that they that really bothered them was this composition of the Indian army, because this was not a national army, and they thought that we have to somehow make it a representative army. So they commissioned surveys and studies on how to give it a more national character. And this is one of their demands, really, that you need to have Indian officers, and you need to open up recruitment to other kinds of people. So when talk about partition happened in 1945-46, and that's when the Indian army was being demobilized, and some Congress leaders, and not just Congress leaders, but even others, people like Ambedkar, B.R. Ambedkar, who eventually became the chairman of the drafting committee who wrote the Indian Constitution. Yeah. So even Ambedkar, he was of the opinion that if people want Pakistan, let them have it, because they will also get a Punjabi Muslim-dominated infantry army. Okay, and so the thought was that if there's such an domination by the Punjabis in the army, then the army will forever remain a Punjabi army, and then because of this cohesion, a democratic government may not be possible in India. That's why the Congress Party had commissioned those surveys. So they were constantly looking at ways to open up the ranks of the Indian army, make it more Indian and more representational in nature, so that it did not remain a colonial instrument of oppression.
And has that move been successful? Has there been more?
Yes, there has been a lot of success, because the moment India became independent, one of the first things that the new Indian Army chief did in 1949 was to raise an all-India, all-class regiment, which was the Brigade of the Guards. Okay, so they decided to open up recruitment and open up the ranks for people from all places. So that's why all India class regiments. So that was a concept that was brought in. And but then regiments that had very strict recruitment criteria confined to certain castes or clans or communities have also continued. Because very recently there has been a debate about the president's bodyguard recruiting only from 3 castes and not anyone else. Okay, or 3 groups, really.
Is that legally allowed in India, or was that just something they were?
Well, see, this is something which I think politicians have not really talked about. And then even though you have equality in every sense in India, at least on paper, But at least in the Indian Army, because the army top brass always decided to, speak for the army, and they said that, okay, we know the what suits the army better than politicians. That's why the politicians never really interfered in this composition of the army.
Hmm.
So that is true. And you still have regiments like, say, for example, the Sikh regiment.
Hmm.
The Sikh regiment has Jat Sikhs, and the Sikh light infantry has the Mazhabi Sikhs. The Mazhabi Sikhs are those low caste converts to Sikhism.
I
Okay,
see.
so there is always this caste tension, because it's more the officers who actually feel it, because the officers come from everywhere,
Hmm.
and the officers, they always, if you just scratch the surface, you would find that, okay, they do have these apprehensions that their men have. They don't belong to the right caste. So a
Hmm.
Jat Sikh, the Sikh regiment, and a Mazhabi Sikh may not get on very well. Okay, but then that's why we have two different regiments for that. Jat Sikhs will primarily go to the Sikh regiment, and also the Punjab regiment,
Hmm.
and the Mazhabi Sikhs, or the Sikh converts, of course. That's how they had started off originally, or the low caste Sikhs. They would always go to the Sikh light infantry.
Hmm.
So that those things have continued. Yes, that is something which really upsets me at times, because that's caste is a terrible blot
Hmm.
on
Yeah.
India even today. But then the army tends to look at it differently. They think that they don't want to interfere with combat performance, and they still have these ideas that, okay, certain communities fight better.
I,
So
I I remember there was could have been last year. There was someone in India made a comment. Why they know Gujarati war heroes?
right.
And many Gujaratis were understandably upset, and I saw this one article arguing, well, it's because we're trading people. We like to get along with people, and
Mhm.
Sikhs are more martial. So it was interesting how they somehow seem to have internalized that kind of mentality. That
Oh yes, they have internalized it completely, but they also forget that the Gujaratis, even though today the image of the Gujarati is that of a mercantile community,
mm,
um, but there are also soldiers. The Gujarat Sultanate
mm,
was an independent sultanate, which was actually humbled by Akbar. But for over 100 years, the Gujarat sultans, they had their own fleets. They challenged the Portuguese hegemony
mm,
over the seas. They allied with the Venetians. They allied with the Ottoman Empire. Their fleets united. They fought the Portuguese, and they had Gujaratis in their army. So it's not that the Gujaratis have never really taken up arms. It is just that this whole image is a post martial racist theory
mm.
uh, uh, reality. And also because it was a Gujarati, Mohandas Gandhi was a Gujarati, and he led this non-violence movement. And then that
That very
Vaishnavite,
much
yes, he brings
impacted.
that Vaishnavite consciousness along with him,
Mm,
and so that becomes the face of the he since Gandhi becomes the face of the Indian freedom struggle. So his ideas about or his Vaishnavite ideas about life also come along with it, vegetarianism and all those things.
Now, you were talking about, you mentioned the War of 1857. Um,
Right.
maybe let's talk about that. So,
Oh,
historians, there's different names for it. People call it the Indian Mutiny or
right.
the First War of Independence, depending on where your sympathy lays, I guess.
Right.
What I always find interesting is that the historiography has been in contention. It's either argued that it was a nationalist uprising, like a modern nationalist uprising,
Hmm.
or other scholars argue it was more like a kind of a localist reactionary uprising.
Hmm.
How would you how would you describe the mutiny, and what were the factors that led to its breakout?
Well, you must have noticed that I always use the term revolt of 1857,
Mm,
because that's the more in the center. Okay,
mm,
it's that's not nationalistic. It is not imperialistic either, because the Indian Mutiny or the Sepoy Mutiny has been how the British and the West have been describing this event for years. And it was really at the turn of the 20th century when um, someone called Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, who was a student in England at that time, he wrote a book originally in Marathi. It was called The Indian War of Independence, 1857. So this book used the term Indian War of Independence for the first time.
Hmm.
And because Savarkar, in those initial years, he was in England at the India House, along with other um, Indian socialists and French socialists as well, English socialists.
Hmm.
So he used to interact with those people, people like Shamji Krishna Verma and others. So he was really inspired by um, uh, Giuseppe Mazzini and Garibaldi and all these people. You know, so the Italian uh, ideas, that's especially Mazzini's ideas of, uh, of freedom, of liberation, of brotherhood, and all those things. These were the things that actually came into play when Savarkar wrote his book,
Hmm.
which was essentially a reinterpretation of the events of 1857 from a nationalist perspective by bringing in this very European way of interpretation. Okay, so you have these European ideas of war and liberation, freedom, all those things that were literally translocated to the Indian context to explain a 19th century event
Hmm.
from a 20th century perspective. Okay, so that's how the concept of an Indian War of Independence, the first War of Independence, came about.
Hmm.
I have problems with that because, of course, it was not like that.
Hmm.
Um, because if you would see the kind of literature that has been left behind, the kind of arguments that have been made, of course, not everything was written down, but then the oral histories also are important in this regard because the kind of things that you see or hear about the revolt, these don't look like a national war of liberation.
Well,
Okay.
as you mentioned already, it was primarily the Bengali sepoys which revolted,
Absolutely.
and
Yes.
while
And they
the
had,
Gurkhas actually remained loyal to the British, right?
right. And the Bengalis, the Bengal army had reasons uh, to feel disaffected because A, no matter what your acumen was, you could have been as good as Hyder Ali as a soldier, as an officer. But then, if you were an Indian, you could never rise beyond the rank of a subadar major.
Hmm.
You would not be allowed to command European troops. You would not be allowed to command other Indian troops. Of course, you are just a battalion, a small officer. Um, but then you're always, if it's a British cornet or a young British lieutenant, you are you may have 20 or 30 years of service, and in the military you may be the senior most Indian officer, but then the junior most English officer is still superior to you.
Hmm. He still takes precedent to you then.
Yes, he
Yes.
does.
Hmm.
And till the First World War, no Indian was eligible to win the Victoria Cross in battle.
Hmm.
So you had a separate Indian Order of Merit, which was created for Indians who performed excellently in battle. So these are genuine grievances, and of course the pay.
Hmm.
Your pay as the senior most Indian officer was still lower than the senior most British sergeant or the junior most British sergeant.
Hmm.
Okay, who was again not an officer, and of course you could not have compared your pay with the British officer's pay. And interestingly, of course, just to take an aside, even and a British officer in the company's army had the same feeling towards a king's officer, that
Yes,
is
I,
a
I
regular
I
British
was
army
reading how
officer.
there was tension between the company army and the the
Yes,
Crown
absolutely.
Army, because the latter tended to see themselves as more, I guess,
Right,
superior. Yeah.
right. And the British regular army officers, they consider themselves to be more superior to
Mm,
a British officer of an Indian army,
mm,
okay, of an East India Company army. So there was tension on that front as well. But coming back, so the Indian soldiers, their pay was not enough. The raises were not enough, and the raises never came frequently. Now you have regular promotion, pay commissions in India,
mm,
which periodically revise the pay of soldiers. But back then it was not so. So every 20 years or so, you would have one raise. So a sepoy who is earning 10 rupees or 7 rupees a month, his salary is raised to 10 rupees. And after 10, 5 or 6 years, it's again raised to 11 rupees. So it's like that. So when the revolt of 1857 happened, so the sepoys would earn something about around rupees 7, okay?
mm,
And then with that money, they had to feed their families, buy their uniforms, keep them in order, and also take care of their animals if they're in the cavalry.
mm,
So that was not enough. And the living standards were, of course, better as compared to other Indians, but still not great.
mm,
So, and of course, these Bengal army troops being caste Hindus, so they always were apprehensive about being sent abroad because the Hinduism practiced in North India at that time, the social taboos were too strong. And it was you would lose your caste if you went across the black waters meaning the sea.
mm,
Okay. So, and the British realized this, and that's why they started a penal settlement in the Andamans. And they would, if you are an Indian who has been caught in a rebellion or in a crime, grievous crime, if you're not shot or hanged, then you would be exiled to the Andamans
mm.
because that's Kala Pani. And the moment you cross the black waters, that is the ocean, you lose your caste. So if you come back, you are excommunicated. You're thrown out of the biradari. Biradari means the brotherhood, the caste brotherhood.
Yes.
So you are thrown out of that. Nobody interacts with you. Nobody is going to marry your children. Nobody is going to give you food. So that's essentially a death sentence.
Mm.
So later on, of course, when the British realized that it was becoming too harsh, they also allowed the families to go with them.
Okay. Right.
Okay. So you had those penal settlements which come up in the Andamans. So these families are out of their place forever because they cannot go back because nobody's going to accept them.
Mm,
So the Bengal army was sent on overseas missions, and they loathed that because that was like losing their caste. So you see that the entire 19th century was one of rebellions uh, in India against the British. So it started off with the Vellore Mutiny of the Indian Army in 1806. And then you had other kinds of rebellions like the Santals, they rise up. You had the Bhil uprising, which
mm,
happens. So everywhere, company rule is being resisted. So this is the situation where the Bengal army finds itself in 1857, where they're not happy. They want these, and of course, just to compensate the more for their loss of caste, the British used to give them a batta or an allowance,
mm,
overseas service allowance. They decided to stop that as well.
mm.
Okay, so a whole lot of factors worked, and then of course the East India Company was also carrying out social reforms. You see, sati was abolished in 29.
There was changes in the Hindu inheritance and marriage customs laws as well. So,
Right,
yeah.
absolutely.
Mm,
Absolutely. So there were a lot of social reforms which are going on. And you have the missionaries who had come in,
mm,
who had set up camps, the Serampore mission, and in fact, the Serampore mission in the local Bengali, Orthodox Bengalis used to, Serampore became a pejorative for Christians, a pejorative expression for Christians and somebody who was aligned to Christians or who was an ally of the British. So there's songs in Bengali that mention that they refer to this. So anyhow, so because of these reforms as well, they thought that probably their religion, their caste, all of that was under siege
Hmm.
by this new Christian force. So this was the primary motivation,
Hmm.
all of these together, when when the revolt happens in May 1857. And also because the British don't read the situation very well, they decide to use force when they realize that there's already so much disaffection within the army.
I think they would just immediately disband kind of
Yes,
rebellious regiments, and that just caused other soldiers to be kind of axy, I suppose.
absolutely. And when the regiments are disbanded, they feel dishonored
Hmm.
because if you're a soldier, and they did have these soldierly ethos, so it was considered to be a serious dishonor, disgrace, if for no fault of yours, you have been disbanded, your unit has been disbanded, and you have been cashiered out.
Hmm.
Because if you go back to your village and tell them that I have been thrown out of the army, then you lose your prestige, whatever reputation you have built up over the years being in the army, because the army was seen as a very prestigious employment. So if you have been thrown out of the army for no fault of yours, you have not mutinied, it's just that somebody else in your unit had mutinied, and therefore the entire battalion or the entire regiment was disbanded. So it came across as a gross affront
Hmm.
to the Indian soldier. So you have to remember that as well. So when the British go about disbanding troops, they feel insulted,
Hmm.
and of course that insult becomes so intense to their mind that they are willing to put their lives at risk and everything else by mutinying. So that happens, along with other things, of course. That the British use force, and the first trigger is really at Meerut, where the Third Bengal Native Infantry, um, about 90 of them, 90 men are issued these carbines
The
loaded
famous Enfield
in the Enfield.
rifles. Yeah,
Yes, and they refused to use the cartridges because of that rumor
there was
that
pig and cow fat.
yeah, cow and pig fat. It's actually talon that was used,
Hmm.
and I think Saul David has written about it, and I like what he says because I think that argument is very sound because the British had they were experimenting with a new kind of cartridge which would not get soiled in different climates, so they had to use a kind of grease, and they realized that talon was actually a better grease because it was made of pig fat or cow fat,
Hmm.
and maybe it would be a ideal good for any condition. So they send a whole consignment of cartridges from England, and they ask Indians to use, I mean carry, not use. Indians are given 60 rounds. Indian sepoys were, that was the standard issue.
Hmm.
For every musket that you carry, you're given 60 rounds of ammunition. So these 60 paper cartridges you are given, and you were asked to carry and not use them. So eventually, they going by that record, the entire consignment goes back. So nobody actually used any of those cartridges that had pig fat or cow fat. But anyway, the rumor spreads from some factory in Bengal that the British are out to destroy our caste and our faith because they are using fat from taboo meat.
Hmm.
Pork is taboo for Muslims, beef is taboo for Hindus. So I think it was also used as a propaganda by Indians themselves to organize and rally people around them. Because the moment you talk about beef and cow fat, you invoke sensibilities that are both Muslim and Hindu. So
Hmm.
it was possible to unite people by using religion or a threat to religion as
Yes,
a cause.
I think as I understand, as you said, there was all these different factors: pay, promotion, feelings that religious sensibilities were being threatened, I guess. But It's I guess these cartridges were kind of like the final insult.
Right, and that was the immediate cause. But even without the cartridges, I think at some point this would have
Mm,
the revolt would have broken out because there was so much disaffection, and
mm.
the British were reading it so wrong. They were ignoring warning signs, and that's why they even in the the history of the Indian Mutiny that Kay and Mallison they write. I think G.B. Mallison uh, he writes it in the preface, the blaming the East India Company and the and the administration for causing disaffection among the ranks and not reading the signs properly.
There was also a breakdown in trust between the British officers and the sepoys.
Oh
The
yes, there was
mm,
there was a breakdown of trust, and like I said, it's primarily because you see it took years. It took years for
mm,
um, the trust to build among sepoys, an Indian soldier and a British officer,
mm.
and a young recruit, fresh from England, and who was suddenly thrust at the head of 1,000 Indians. Not always behaved ideally, not always could show respect to the Indians. So I think those things also had a role to play in this. All these factors contributed to the outbreak of the revolt. And once it started, you see, it always happens that mass movements start uh, because of a certain reason, and then they are picked up by others for entirely different reasons.
Mm.
Right, people just start joining in, and they may have different motivations for that. For
I think
example,
it's
look at Indian.
but people have pointed to the reason why the revolt was eventually crushed was because there was no like uniform leadership. It was more just a sporadic uprising in certain areas.
Absolutely, and also because Indians had no officer experience, so you were not allowing Indians to actually fill up the roles of British officers. So even though you are leading your own men, but then being a proper officer, a commissioned officer, and being just uh, an Indian officer was, I think, entirely different. So you did not know how to, you could not plan the higher direction of war.
Mm.
You did not have any experience of leading different battalions and or different units into battle. So an Indian officer would be responsible to a particular unit. It was not necessary that other Indians from other units would also accept his authority, his command, because he's not the British officer.
Mm.
The British officer would lead all those units. The colonel of a regiment, even today, or colonel of a battalion, would always command respect of all the different units of his uh, men.
Mm.
But then the same could not be said about the company's army, the Indians in the company's army back then, because if you're a subadar and you may command respect of one regiment, but you may not command respect of other regiments that are also Indian. So this crisis in leadership was pretty much the reason why it did not go forward successfully.
And
And
sorry, you were saying.
also, yes, also a poor understanding of because they all of them decided to come to Delhi, most of them actually. And once you surround yourself, you you are besieged in the capital.
Mm.
You have allowed the British to shore up their defenses elsewhere. You have allowed them to regroup and reform and come back and attack you at
Mm.
your stronghold. You have not bothered to have different power centers that can coordinate
Mm.
and plan the direction of the campaign. So all these things were lacking in among Indians at that time, and therefore the revolt broke out.
And what happened after the revolt was eventually stamped out? Was there any reforms made in the army? I mean, you already mentioned the fact that Bengalis were kind of there was no attempt to recruit Bengalis after that. Was there any other changes made?
You see, the formation of the army also underwent changes, like I said, and but these were not very abrupt changes. Of course, these happened over a period of time, say 20, 30 years after the revolt.
Mm.
You had many changes that came in. Like I said, the troop composition was changed.
Mm.
So then if you had more Gurkhas now, more Punjabis, Muslims, and Sikhs, Pathans, so obviously the whole culture of the army also changes.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure if there were prejudices against the Bengalis, even though it's quite possible before 1857, but definitely after 1857, there was completely no recruitment from among Bengalis. But there
Hmm.
was some recruitment still from UP and Bihar, even though it was down to bare minimum.
This is the end of part 1 of episode 2 of the Silk Roads and Monsoon Winds podcast, India at War. Stay tuned for part 2, where me and Mr. Sharma will discuss India at war during both world wars, as well as in the contemporary era.